Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Fair warning, tonight's collection is different. These aren't just random encounters with weird neighbors. These are stories about escalation, about boundaries being crossed 1 inch at a time until suddenly you realize you're trapped in someone else's twisted obsession. Each story gets progressively more disturbing, and by the end, you'll understand why some doors should never be opened, some hellos should never be returned, and some neighbors should never ever be trusted. Now, comma. Let's begin with story number 1, but remember, after tonight, you might never look at your own neighbors the same way again. Story 1. The Watcher Next Door. I moved into the duplex on Maple Street last October, a quiet residential area in Portland where people minded their own business. The rent was affordable, the neighborhood seemed safe, and my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was a pleasant elderly woman who kept to herself. Perfect, I thought. I was 28, working remotely as a graphic designer, and all I wanted was peace and quiet to rebuild my life after a messy breakup. The first sign something was wrong came during my second week there. I was working late, around 11 p.m., when I noticed a faint blue glow coming from the window across the small courtyard between our units. Not unusual. People watch TV late, right? But this light was different. It was steady, unchanging, like a computer screen that never flickered or shifted. I shrugged it off and went back to work. 3 days later, I was making coffee in my kitchen when I happened to glance out the window. There, in the window directly across from mine, stood a man. Tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dark sweater. He was Jew. Silence. Complete, dead silence. I could see light under the door, hear the faint hum of electronics inside, but no footsteps, no response. I knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're in there. Answer the door." Nothing. It was like knocking on the door of an empty house, except I knew he was inside. I knew he was listening. I called the police, but what could they do? No law against standing in your own window, they said. No law against taking pictures from your own property, even across a courtyard. "Maybe install some better blinds," the officer suggested helpfully. I wanted to scream. But the pictures were just the beginning. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things, small things that made my skin crawl. The mailbox I was sure I'd locked was sometimes open when I came home. My trash, which I always put out Tuesday mornings, would sometimes be disturbed, not scattered, just shifted, like someone had carefully gone through it and tried to put everything back exactly as it was. And then there were the deliveries, packages showing up at my door that I never ordered. Strange items, a small potted plant, a scented candle, a book of poetry with certain passages highlighted in yellow, no return address, no delivery confirmation emails. When I called the shipping companies, they had no record of the orders. It was like they materialized out of thin air. The worst part was how he'd escalated from just watching to studying. I could feel it in the way the blue light from his window seemed to track my movement through my house. How he'd appear in the window within minutes of me entering any room that faced his unit. Like he had some kind of system, some way of monitoring when I was where. I started documenting everything. Photos of the disturbed trash, pictures of the unwanted deliveries, screenshots of my phone calls to shipping companies. I packed a bag and left that same day. I'm staying with friends now, trying to figure out what to do next. The lease has 10 months left on it, and I can't afford to break it. But I can't go back there, not knowing he's still watching, still waiting. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Yesterday, my friend Sarah mentioned seeing a man in a dark sweater standing across the street from her apartment building, just standing there looking up at the windows. She said he was there for hours, never moving, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. And the worst part, I never told her what my neighbor looked like. Story 2, the helpful neighbor. The thing about Mr. Rodriguez was how helpful he was. That should have been my first warning sign, but when you're a single mom working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, helpful neighbors feel like a blessing from heaven. I should have known better. I should have trusted that crawling feeling in my stomach every time he smiled at me with those two white teeth. I moved into the apartment complex in Riverside, California, with my daughter Emma, who was 6 at the time. It was one of those sprawling, maze-like places built in the 70s, with thin walls and thinner bank accounts. The rent was what I could afford, barely, and the neighborhood was safe enough. Mr. Rodriguez lived in the unit directly below us, and from day one, he made it clear he was there to help. "Please, call me Miguel," he said when I introduced myself, flashing that perfect smile. He was maybe 50, well-groomed, always dressed like he was heading to an office job, even though I never saw him leave for work. "If you need anything at all, I'm right downstairs. Don't hesitate to ask." And at first, it really was helpful. When my car wouldn't start one Tuesday morning and I was panicking about being late for work, Miguel appeared. "He's so thoughtful," I told my sister Linda over the phone, but even as I said it, something felt wrong. The gifts were too specific, too perfectly timed. The children's book arrived the day after Emma mentioned loving unicorns, a conversation that happened in our apartment with the windows closed. The casserole appeared exactly when I'd gotten home from a double shift, exhausted and hungry, like he'd been watching and waiting for the perfect month. And the flowers. The flowers were varieties that bloomed at night, their scent strongest after dark. Emma loved them, but they made me feel exposed somehow, like they were drawing attention to our little balcony, marking it. "Mom, Mr. Miguel knows everything," Emma said one evening as I tucked her into bed. She said it with the innocent admiration 6-year-olds have for adults who pay attention to them, but it made my stomach clench, because she was right. He did know everything, Dot. He knew Emma's favorite color was purple before I'd ever mentioned it. He knew I worked late on Thursdays because that's when the cleaning service I worked for did the medical offices. He knew Emma had trouble sleeping when it rained because he'd left an umbrella nightlight by our door after a particularly stormy week, again, without me ever mentioning Emma's weather-related anxiety. "How does he know so much about us?" I asked Emma one morning, trying to keep my voice casual. Dot. She shrugged, spooning cereal into her mouth. "He asks me questions when you're not looking. He's really interested in our family." My blood went cold. "What kind of questions, honey?" "Like, what time do you get home? What do we do on weekends? If we have family who visit? If anyone else has keys to our apartment?" She looked up at me with those big brown eyes, completely innocent. "He says he wants to make sure we're safe." I felt like I was falling through That realization hit me like a physical blow. I changed the locks that weekend, not telling anyone in the complex, not even the landlord. I paid for it out of my grocery money and installed them myself, watching YouTube videos until my hands stopped shaking enough to hold the screwdriver steady. But Miguel's helpfulness didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. He began leaving longer notes with his gifts, detailed observations about Emma's growth, my work stress, our daily routines. The notes weren't threatening exactly, but they revealed a level of attention that made my skin crawl. I noticed Emma seems tired lately. Growing girls need their sleep. Perhaps an earlier bedtime would help. I'd be happy to read her stories if you need to work late. I know all her favorites. How did he know her favorites? I'd never told him what books Emma liked. But he was right. She did prefer the fairy tale collections, the ones with princesses who saved themselves. How long had he been watching us? How closely? The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night. I was working late and Emma was staying with my sister Linda across town. I came home exhausted, fumbling with my new keys in the dark when I heard his voice from the stairwell below. "Working late again, Maria? You work so hard for that little girl." I turned, and there he was, standing at the bottom of the stairs in the shadows, still wearing that gentle smile even though it was nearly midnight. He was dressed in dark clothes, and I realized with a chill that I wouldn't have seen him if he hadn't spoken. "Just getting home?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my hands shook with the keys. "Long day." "I know," he said, and something in his tone made me freeze. "I worry about you, both of you, alone up there. So many things can happen when a woman lives alone with a small child. So many dangers." Fine," I managed, finally getting the key to turn. "Thanks for your concern." "Of course you are," he said, but he didn't move from the bottom of the stairs. "I make sure of that. I watch over you both. Always." I bolted up the stairs and slammed the door behind me, throwing every lock I had installed. But as I stood there in the dark, trying to catch my breath, I heard his footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right outside my door. And then, so softly I almost thought I imagined it, the sound of a key sliding into a lock. My new locks held. The sound stopped, and after what felt like hours, I heard him retreat back downstairs. But the message was clear. He had tried to use a key. He expected to be able to get in, which meant he'd had a key to the old locks. I packed our bags that night and never went back. Linda helped me break the lease, forfeit the deposit, start over somewhere new. We moved 3 cities away, changed our phone number. Emma started at a new school. But sometimes, when I'm tucking Emma into bed in our new apartment, she'll look toward the window and say, "I miss Mr. Miguel. He was so nice to us." And I wonder what else he taught her during all those helpful conversations when I wasn't looking. What other seeds he planted in her 6-year-old mind. Because even now, 2 years later, Emma still draws pictures of our family that include a 4th figure standing just outside the frame, watching over us with a smile that looks too familiar. She says it's her guardian angel. But I know better. Story 3. The sound through the walls. The apartment building on Cherry Street looked normal from the outside. 3 stories of red brick, neat little balconies, a small lobby with fake plants and fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly. I was 24, fresh out of college, and it was all I could afford on my entry-level marketing salary. The lease was month to month, which should have been my first red flag, but I was desperate, and the landlord, Mrs. Kim, seemed nice enough. "Very quiet building," she assured me as we walked through the studio apartment on the 2nd floor. "Good tenants. No parties, no noise complaints. You'll love it here." She was right about it being quiet. Too quiet, actually. During the day, you could hear every footstep in the hallway, every door closing, every phone conversation through the thin walls. But at night, the building fell into a silence so complete it was almost oppressive. Almost. I lived there for 3 weeks before I heard the first sound. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember checking my phone when it woke me up. A soft, scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from the wall that separated my apartment from 2B. Just a few seconds of gentle scratch, 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 then silence. I lay there in the dark, listening. But it didn't happen again. Probably mice in the walls, I told myself. Old building, thin walls, urban wildlife. No big deal. But it happened again the next night. Same time, 2:17 a.m. Exactly. Same soft scratching. This time it lasted longer, maybe 30 seconds, and I could swear I heard a pattern to it. 3 short scratches, pause, 3 long scratches, pause, 3 short scratches again. SOS in Morse code. I almost laughed at myself for that thought. Who the hell would be tapping SOS in Morse code through apartment walls at 2 a.m.? But once the idea was in my head, I couldn't shake it. I'd learned Morse code in Boy Scouts, one of those random skills that seemed useless, until suddenly it wasn't. The third night, I was ready. Phone in hand, recording app open, lying in bed, staring at the wall like I could see through it. 2:17 a.m. came and went. No scratching. I felt foolish, like I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, at 2:23 a.m., it started again. But this time, it wasn't just scratching. It was definitely Morse code, and it definitely spelled out SOS. Over and over again. SOS, SOS, SOS. I knocked on the wall, 3 quick raps. The scratching stopped immediately. Then, after a long pause, 3 scratches came back. Someone was responding. My heart was pounding as I grabbed a pen and started tapping out a message. "Who are you?" The response came slowly, carefully. HELPME. I sat there in the dark, staring at the wall, trying to process what was happening. Someone in 2B was asking for help, but I'd never seen anyone going in or out of that apartment. Mrs. Kim had told me it was vacant, had been for months. I tapped back. "Who are you?" The response was so faint I had to press my ear against the wall to hear it. S-R-A-H, Sarah. There was someone named Sarah in the supposedly empty apartment next door, tapping SOS in Morse code at 2:17 every morning. Someone who needed help. I threw on clothes and went into the hallway, standing outside apartment 2B. The door was painted the same institutional beige as all the others, with a brass number that looked like it hadn't been polished in years. I knocked softly. "Sarah? Are you okay in there?" Silence. Complete, dead silence. I knocked again, louder. "Sarah, it's your neighbor from 2A. I heard you tapping. Do you need help?" Nothing. But I could feel someone listening on the other side of that door. The kind of presence you sense even when you can't see or hear proof of it. I tried the doorknob. Locked, of course. But as I stood there, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The bottom of the door had a small gap, maybe half an inch, and from that gap came the faintest breath of air. Not fresh air, stale, thick air that smelled like fear and unwashed bodies and something else, something medical and sharp. I went back to my apartment and tried to sleep, but every creak of the building made me jump. The next morning, I called Mrs. Kim. "Apartment 2B," she said, and I could hear papers shuffling on her end. "That unit's been empty for 6 months. Why?" "I thought I heard someone in there last night. Are you sure it's vacant?" "Completely sure. I can show you the unit if you'd like. Been trying to rent it for months, but..." She trailed off. "But what?" "Well, the last tenant had some problems. Mental health issues. It's been hard to rent since then. People get spooked by empty apartments, you know?" That afternoon, Mrs. Kim met me in the hallway with a ring of keys. She unlocked 2B and pushed the door open, and I immediately understood why it had been hard to rent. The apartment was completely empty, but it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The walls had irregular stains that could have been water damage or could have been something else. The carpet was newer than mine, like it had been recently replaced, but it didn't quite fit properly around the edges. And the smell, that medical, chemical smell I had noticed under the door, was stronger inside. Previous tenant was troubled, Mrs. Kim said, wrapping her arms around herself. Sarah, something, had to be removed by paramedics. Very sad situation. Removed? I asked, but she was already backing toward the door. I'll leave you to look around. Lock up when you're done. I stood alone in that empty apartment, and it felt like standing in a tomb. But tombs don't have scratch marks on the walls, and there they were. Faint, but visible once you knew to look for them. Concentrated around the wall that connected to my apartment. Hundreds of tiny scratches like someone had been desperately trying to claw their way out. Or trying to communicate. That night, I didn't wait for 2:17 a.m. At midnight, I pressed my ear to the wall and knocked 3 times. Almost immediately, the response came back. 3 scratches, so faint they might have been my imagination. I tapped out, Sarah. The response, Y-S. My blood went cold. But I kept going. Where are you? S-T-I-L-L-H-E-R-E. Still here. But the apartment was empty. I'd seen it myself, walked through every room, checked every closet. There was no one there. L-P-M-E-G-E-T-O-U-T. I tapped back. How? But there was no response. Just silence that stretched until dawn. The next day, I did some research. Sarah Martinez, 23, had lived in apartment 2B for 8 months before what the police report called a mental health crisis. Neighbors had complained about crying and scratching sounds coming from her apartment. When police did a welfare check, they found her in an advanced state of malnutrition and dehydration, convinced that she was trapped in the walls and couldn't find her way out. She'd been hospitalized, then transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility. That was 7 months ago. But every night at 2:17 a.m., she was still there, still trapped, still scratching SOS into the wall that separated her world from mine. I tried everything. I researched the building's history, talked to other tenants, even contacted the psychiatric facility where Sarah was being treated. The facility confirmed she was a patient there, heavily medicated, mostly nonverbal. When I asked if she ever talked about being trapped in walls, the nurse got quiet. She draws, she finally said. Same picture, over and over. A room with scratch marks on the walls and a person on the other side listening. The scratching continued every night. Sometimes it was just SOS. Sometimes it was longer messages. Cold, hungry, can't get out, please help. I started responding, tapping back words of comfort, promises that help was coming, lies that felt necessary. But what help could I give to someone who wasn't there? How do you rescue someone from a place that doesn't exist? 3 months into this nightly ritual, the messages changed. He's coming. Who? I tapped back. The man who put me here. What man? And then, for the first time since this all started, I heard something other than scratching. A voice, so faint it might have been the wind coming through the wall. He has keys to everyone's apartment. He comes at night. He watches us sleep. He chooses. I never heard from Sarah again after that night. The scratching stopped. 2:17 a.m. came and went in silence. But I started noticing other things. Footsteps in the hallway at odd hours that didn't correspond to any tenant I had ever seen. The smell of cigarettes in the stairwell, even though smoking wasn't allowed in the building. The feeling of being watched whenever I came home late. And then I found the key. It was taped under my kitchen sink, hidden behind the pipe where no one would think to look unless they were specifically searching. An extra key to my apartment, worn smooth like it had been used many times. How long had it been there? How many times had someone let themselves in while I was sleeping? I moved out the next day, broke my lease, forfeited my deposit. Mrs. Kim seemed unsurprised, almost like she'd been expecting it. "Did you ever hear anything strange?" she asked as I handed over my keys. "Like what?" "Like scratching in the walls. Previous tenants, sometimes me, had mentioned it, usually right before they decided to leave." I stared at her. "How many previous tenants?" She shrugged. "Buildings had a lot of turnover lately. People don't seem to stay long." As I loaded my car, I looked up at the second-floor windows. Most were dark, but in one, apartment 2B, I could swear I saw a shadow moving back and forth, like someone pacing in an empty room. Like someone still trying to find their way out. I never found out who had the key to my apartment. But sometimes, in my new place across town, I'll wake up at 2:17 a.m. and hear scratching in the walls. Faint, desperate scratching that spells out the same message over and over. He's coming for you, too. And I wonder how many apartments have a Sarah trapped inside the walls, scratching messages that only one person ever hears. How many people like me have found extra keys hidden in their homes, put there by someone who watches, who chooses, who collects. But I don't tap back anymore, because some conversations are too dangerous to continue, and some neighbors are closer than you think. Story: the garden, Mrs. Henley's garden, was the pride of Sycamore Lane. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, she'd be outside in her wide-brimmed hat and gardening gloves, tending to the most spectacular flower beds I'd ever seen. Roses that bloomed impossibly large, dahlias in colors that seemed almost unnatural, and vegetables that grew with a vigor that made other neighbors joke she must have made a deal with the devil. "Green thumb doesn't begin to describe it," my next-door neighbor Janet would say, shaking her head as she watched Mrs. Henley work. That woman could grow prize-winning tomatoes in concrete. I moved into the house next to Mrs. Henley's in late spring when her garden was just beginning to hit its stride. I was 32, recently divorced, and looking forward to a quiet suburban life where my biggest concern would be remembering to water my sad little lawn. Mrs. Henley seemed like the perfect neighbor, polite, quiet, and clearly someone who took pride in maintaining her property. The first time we spoke, she was pruning her rose bushes while I struggled to get my lawnmower started. She looked up with a warm smile, her weathered face kind beneath the brim of her hat. "New to gardening?" she asked, nodding towards my obviously neglected flower beds. "New to everything, pretty much," I admitted. "I don't think I could keep a cactus alive." She laughed, a genuine sound that made me like her immediately. "Nonsense. Plants just need attention and the right nutrients. I'd be happy to give you some tips sometime." And she did. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Henley became my unofficial gardening mentor. She'd appear at the fence between our properties whenever I was outside, offering advice about soil composition, watering schedules, and which plants would thrive in our climate. She even gave me some starter plants from her own garden. small offshoots that she promised would grow into beautiful specimens with proper care. The secret, she told me one evening as we both worked in our respective yards, is giving them what they need to grow. Most people think it is just water and sunlight, but plants are hungrier than that. They need nutrients, minerals, things that make them strong from the roots up. She was right. The plants she'd given me flourished like nothing I'd ever grown before. My sad little flower bed transformed into something worthy of a magazine cover, and I found myself spending more and more time outside, drawn by the satisfaction of nurturing something beautiful. But as summer progressed, I started noticing things about Mrs. Henley's routine that seemed unusual. She worked in her garden at odd hours, not just the early morning sessions I had grown accustomed to, but late at night too. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and see her out there in the darkness, a small headlamp illuminating her work as she dug and planted in sections of the garden that seemed perfectly healthy during the day. Night work, she explained when I casually asked about it. Some plants prefer to be transplanted in the cool, dark hours, less shock to their systems. That made sense, I supposed, though I'd never heard of such a thing. But Mrs. Henley clearly knew what she was doing. Her garden grew more spectacular each week, drawing admiring comments from neighbors and even strangers who would slow down while driving past, just to stare at the riot of color and life that somehow thrived despite the increasingly harsh summer heat. It was in July that I first noticed the smell. I was watering my own plants one evening when a breeze carried a scent from Mrs. Henley's yard that made me wrinkle my nose. It wasn't the sweet floral fragrance I'd grown used to, but something else entirely. Something organic and rich, but with an underlying note that reminded me unpleasantly of the meat section of the grocery store on a hot day. "Is that fertilizer?" I called over the fence where Mrs. Henley was working in what appeared to be a newly expanded section of her garden. She looked up, her face shadowed beneath her hat. "Organic compost," she said. "Very rich, very effective. The plants absolutely thrive on it." Over the following weeks, that smell became more noticeable, especially during Mrs. Henley's nighttime gardening sessions. It would drift across the fence in waves, thick and cloying, making me close my windows despite the summer heat. But I had to admit, whatever she was using was working. Her garden had grown into something that seemed almost supernatural in its abundance. The roses were the size of dinner plates. The vegetables hung heavy on vines that seemed to grow inches every day. And there were new sections appearing regularly, areas that had been simple lawn now converted to carefully tended beds that sprouted new growth with impossible speed. "She's expanding again," Janet observed one morning as we both stared over at Mrs. Henley's property. "Must be running out of space soon." But Mrs. Henley always seemed to find more space. Areas that had been perfectly good grass would be dug up overnight, transformed into new planting beds that would be green and flourishing within days. It was like she had an endless supply of whatever miracle fertilizer she was using. I might never have thought more about it if not for Buster. Buster was a neighborhood cat, a friendly orange tabby who belonged to the Johnsons 3 houses down, but considered the entire block his territory. He was one of those social cats who would visit everyone's yards, looking for attention and the occasional treat. I'd grown fond of him, and often found him sunning himself on my back patio. In early August, Buster disappeared. Not unusual for outdoor cats, the Johnsons assured everyone. Sometimes they wander off for days at a time. But days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and Buster still hadn't come home. He was such a routine-oriented cat. Mrs. Johnson told me sadly, as we both checked our garages and sheds for any sign of him. Never missed dinner, never stayed away overnight. It's, unlike him. That's when I remembered seeing Buster in Mrs. Henley's garden just a few days before he disappeared. I'd been heading to my car for work when I spotted that familiar orange fur weaving between her rose bushes. I'd called out to him, but he seemed focused on something near the back of her garden, in one of the newer sections she'd been working on. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, "Mrs. Henley," I called over the fence that evening as she worked in her garden, "have you seen Buster lately? The Johnson's cat?" She paused in her digging, straightening slowly. "Buster? Orange Tabby. He used to visit your garden sometimes." "Oh, yes," she said, but something in her tone made me look at her more closely. "I haven't seen him recently. Cats do wander, you know. Probably found himself a lady friend somewhere." But as she spoke, I noticed she was standing protectively in front of one of her newer garden beds, the one where I'd last seen Buster exploring. And that smell, that rich, organic smell that had been getting stronger all summer, seemed particularly intense in that exact spot. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Buster's friendly face and wondered where he might be. Around 2 a.m., I heard the familiar sounds of Mrs. Henley's nighttime gardening, the soft scrape of shovel against earth, the rustle of plants being moved. I got up and looked out my bedroom window. She was working in the same area where I'd last seen Buster, digging carefully in the darkness. But as I watched, something caught my eye. Something small and orange partially buried in the fresh soil, barely visible in the glow of her headlamp. Buster's collar. I felt my stomach drop. But before I could process what I was seeing, Mrs. Henley noticed it too. She quickly scooped it up and shoved it into her pocket, then continued digging. Now, as if nothing had happened,